Hello everyone, Bible believers around the world. So this is something very important to cover. I actually had a dream about covering this subject. So here I am. This is something that I have personal experience with, and it's something that is leaking into the Israelite community, and it must be shut down and exposed. And the title of today's lesson is Ireland and Scotland don't belong to the Israelites. Now, there's a problem with a lot of us Israelites where we like to claim ownership and heritage over the lands where we've been scattered. You have many Israelites, who've been in America for many years, and they say stuff like, make America great again. And, this is my country, and, wearing the flag and all this other type of stuff. This is my land, and they are completely ignorant of the fact of how they got there and why they are there. And we're going to get into that a little bit later. Now, Europe is an interesting thing because you have some Israelites who are actually trying to claim biblical ownership over Europe and say that the Caucasian, the so-called white man, is, the evil devil who stole Europe, and that originally Europe was all black and Israelite. That is false. And we're going to read right now. Ireland and Scotland don't belong to the Israelites. After the fall of Jerusalem and the Israelite kingdom to the Gentile invaders, the 12 tribes of Israel lost their native land and were scattered to the four corners of the earth. And some of these Israelites, who were captured in the Assyrian captivity, were carried into different parts of Europe. Some made it as far as Ireland and Scotland. In recent times, many Israelites have started claiming Irish and Scottish heritage because of the Israelite communities that were built by these scattered Jews long ago in these northern lands. Some even go as far to say that these northern regions belong to the Israelites, and the wicked Caucasians stole it. However, that is not true. The Book of Jubilees tells us that all of the land that is in the north, which includes Ireland and Scotland, belong to Japheth, who is the so-called Caucasian people today. Many Israelites get confused and begin to claim ownership of lands where we were scattered due to the fact that we have history in these lands. But we forget that if Israel never rejected Yah, we would still have our kingdom and therefore would have never went to America, Europe, or Mexico in the first place. Exactly. I've dealt with many Israelites who learn about the Portuguese Jews, and now they're hating on the Japhethite Portuguese, or calling them names like devils and liars and thieves, and, saying, we're Portuguese, they're fake, they're Esau, we're Portuguese. That's false. Because you need to remember, before we get into Jubilees and who these lands were given to by the Most High Yah himself, and who these lands belong to and their descendants forever until the end of time, we need to understand that America, Scotland, Ireland, Portugal, Africa, Mexico, Brazil, every place where we were scattered, that was never in the plan. We had our own kingdom, and we had our own land that the Most High Yah promised under Abraham. The only reason we even ended up in these places is because we disobeyed the Most High, and we lost our land, and we had to flee, and we were scattered to the four corners of the earth. You would have never had, these small little pockets of black Israelite communities, long ago in Scotland and Ireland, and the Portuguese Jews, and the Sephardic Jews of Spain, and the scattered Israelites in Africa, in Mexico and Brazil. None of that would have ever happened if we had not disobeyed the Most High, because we would still have our own kingdom, we would have our own government and our own land, and we would have no reason to move out of our area. So we need to understand that us being in these lands was a mistake to start with. It was not a blessing for us to be in these areas, because we had our own home and our own government. We weren't supposed to be there. It was because of our transgression that we were scattered to the four corners of the earth, and that we ended up in these places. So when you're saying make America great again, and you're proud of being an American, or, you're vexing, the Gentiles of Scotland, telling them that it's not their land, you don't even understand the history of how we got there. Look at the Assyrian captivity. That's how we got carried into all these places. Israelites sailed and, fled what was going on in their homeland with the Gentile invaders. We need to understand that. All right? Now I'm going to get it, before I get into Jubilees, I'm going to get into something else people say. People say, okay, if Europe belongs to the so-called white man, then where were the white people during the Moorish era? And they say, see, got you beat. Because they pull up all these black depictions of Europe, like black people in France, the Moors, and, black Scots and black Irish, all this type of stuff. And that's what they use as proof to say that, the so-called white man stole Europe and it's not his and all that type of stuff. But when you follow the scriptures and you study the history, you know why white people were not seen a lot in Europe during those days and dark times. Let's get down here. For those who might wonder and ask where all the so-called white people were during the Moorish period of Europe, if the scripture says that it's their land, the answer is the sons and daughters of Japheth dwelled in darkness for years, living in caves, while the other nations made communities on the continent. It's like the Jews of Portugal. The blacks were aware of these native barbarian whites, and the Moors were said to dislike the whites of the north because of their big bellies and lack of intelligence. This can be seen in scripture, as in Jubilees it says that Japheth dwelled in the mountains of Turkey originally. And in modern day, whites say that they come from the mountains of Turkey and the Caucasus Mountains, but they don't say the timeline when they left the mountains. Exactly. Japheth, the white man, was always there. He was not established at this time. He was barbarous in nature. We have brought this up on the channel multiple times, and we'll bring it up again in this lesson. The Moors and the scattered Israelites and the scattered Hamites that were in the land at this time were establishing these communities in Europe, while the sons and daughters of Japheth were still in the mountains. And I'm going to pull it up. The book of Jubilees literally says that at first the sons and daughters of Japheth dwelled on a certain mountain in Turkey. And when you look up that mountain in Turkey in modern day, it's a whole cave city. And modern day historians say that this cave city is the place where the first Christians ever lived. You see, right there. And then you look at old white historians and they say that Japheth dwelled in the Caucasus Mountains before he went to Europe. But what they don't tell you is what time in history that they actually left the Caucasus Mountains and went into Europe. You see, Japheth was over there. He was barbarian at that time. And we have even more proof that white people were already there, because the Moors were already aware of the existence of white people in the land. Like we just read, the Moors had issues with the whites of the north. And then you look even more, and you had black and white relations in France hundreds of years ago. You see, the Moors knew about these native barbarian white people who were already there. Paul knew about them. Paul mentioned the barbarians and the Scythians in the New Testament. And that was like 1,000 years ago. You see, the blacks of Europe knew about these white people who were there. But just as the scripture says, Yah shall enlarge Japheth. Japheth was enlarged, and he began to grow in intelligence and in skill and in population. And he eventually took his land. He started to come out of the mountains and threw these other peoples out, threw Israel out, pushed Ham out, and pushed these other nations out who had come in during his time of darkness and ignorance. People get it so twisted. I've heard so many people talk about, the dark age of Europe and be like, yeah, they were in the woods and all that type of stuff. And they say, see, that was Esau. No, it was not Esau. That was Japheth. And one thing that even backs us up even further is people's names in Hebrew have meaning, no matter if it was about who they were or prophecy, who the descendants would be. It is said about Japheth that they would be a silly and foolish people. And you see that early on in their history when they were barbarian in nature, before they became, Titanic, and before they became, Apple, before they became Elon Musk. They were dwelling in darkness and caves in the wilderness before that. And this is something we need to talk about, and get, people, this might be hard for some people, but this is something that needs to be said. You guys, you were already there.
The once barbarous descendants of Japheth, receiving from the east the gospel and civilization, bear them half around the globe and back to the cradle of the race, to the ancient abodes of power, commerce, and art. Japheth descended to ignorance and perversion of intellectual strength. The tribes of the north were barbarous hordes of Vandals. Rome was a robber empire. Greece was corrupt in the splendor of highest civilization, and the masses of mankind had sunken into gross superstitions, mythologies, and idolatries.